All right, well, it is 7 o'clock, and I can see that we've got some people logging in. I want to try to start on time, and I'll take it a little slow right here at the beginning just so we can allow people to kind of log in. And so while they're doing that, let me just tell a little bit about how I've been doing this and why I do this. Because many of you that are going to be logging on are my students from my online class, and so you've only seen me essentially through the videos, but we haven't had a chance to necessarily talk. So I've been a professor at UVU for 12 years, and I've always taught the introductory course to biology, Biology 1010, and I also have taught very often the course that's called Principles of Evolution, and then I teach every year also a course called Molecular Evolution and Bioinformatics. And so because I'm teaching courses where I teach the subject of evolution, a lot of times I've had students come up after the class or during the class, after a particular lecture and kind of come up to me and be like, can I talk to you? And typically they want to kind of talk a little bit about how they're trying to reconcile their worldview with the things that we're learning in class. And then I started teaching really large classes at UVU, like 400 students at a time. And so it was too much to kind of deal with every student individually, because I'd have to do a kind of an individual talk maybe 30 or 40 times a semester. And so I started to do a night optional talk, which is what we're doing tonight, as a way to kind of transmit the message to a lot of people all at once. Now, if anyone ever wants to come and meet with me privately or do a Zoom meeting, a private Zoom meeting, I'm also happy to meet with you privately. But this is why I do this, is it's kind of a way where we capture a lot of people all at once, and we can answer a lot of questions at once instead of trying to answer them individually multiple times. So I assume we have a lot of people, so now I'm just gonna get going. I'm really happy to do this, and this is the first time I'm trying to do it over Zoom, so we'll see how this goes. But let me talk just a little bit more about who I am. So I was born and raised LDS. Oh, I forgot to say this. For right now, just everyone keep your microphones on mute. And then what'll happen is I'll do a little introduction for about a half an hour or so. And then we'll kind of stop that first part that I'm going to do. And then I'll just open it up to questions. And then we'll just do a question and answer. And I'll do that as long as people want to keep asking questions, okay? But let me kind of get through my introductory remarks, and then we'll go to the question and answer. So I was born and raised LDS. I was actually born in California, but I was raised here in Utah. And my father was a business major at BYU, and then he has been a businessman his whole life. He had a bunch of carpet stores here in Utah. My mom did 2 years at BYU, but then she basically became a stay-at-home mom and helped dad run the business. But not too long ago, at age 68, my wonderful mother graduated from BYU. With a bachelor's degree. And there I am with all of my siblings, and we were so happy for my mom that day. Now, I also grew up in a household where basically the idea was God is the creator, and therefore I accepted essentially kind of what would be called creationism. The idea that the earth is really young, that the creation happened over a few days or maybe a few periods of 1,000 years, but not millions or billions of years old, just a few thousand years old, and that God was very much involved in the creation of all of the organisms. And so that was kind of the Judeo-Christian account of creationism, and I pretty much took that pretty literal. Well, I did 1 year of BYU, and I started BYU with the idea that I was going to be a medical doctor. And along with like every other BYU undergraduate, it felt like at the time, maybe it still feels that way. And then I went on my mission to Chile and loved my mission. But I still had basically that same worldview because I hadn't taken any upper division classes yet in my degree towards, at the time, what was called a zoology degree, which was the degree that pre-medical students mostly did. So then after my mission, I came back and continued to work on my Bachelor of Science in Zoology, thinking I was going to be a medical doctor. After a year of school, I decided to go back to Chile with a friend, and we ended up going back there to visit people that we had taught, and I ended up falling in love with a girl on that trip and married her. And so after I got married, I moved back and finished my bachelor's of science in zoology. I moved to Chile and did a master's of science in Chile in La Universidad de Concepción. And so by this point now, I'm taking senior level classes in biology. Now I'm starting to run into this conflict in my worldview about what I grew up thinking and now what I'm learning in science. And I had started to deal with that in my senior classes at BYU, and then of course in my master's degree in La Universidad de Concepción, because down there too, I'm the minority now. There's no other, Mormon church members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the graduate program down there. I'm all alone. But we do that. We have our first child down there, and then we decide to come and do my PhD. And we do that back at BYU. There was a new professor at BYU that I had looked into a little bit, and he was doing these cool evolutionary research questions on insects. And when I was doing my master's degree, I started to become an entomologist. I described some new species of moths and some other things. And so for me, continuing my PhD in entomology was kind of the pathway that started there, and I no longer was on the pathway to become a medical doctor. So we came back to the United States after living in Chile for almost nearly 4 years, and then and I started my PhD at BYU with basically a PhD in biology, but with an emphasis on evolution of insects. So right now I have a wife, and she is an MD. That's the other reason, you only need one MD in the family. That's good enough. And then I've got 4 kids. 2 are now at BYU, and then I have 2 kids that are still at home with us. And I'm a bishop, and I've always been active in the church, and always been basically going to church. And in fact, after I got married and moved to Chile, I of course went to church in Spanish down in Chile. But even when we moved back to the States, I've always gone to Spanish wards. So I haven't done church in English for a long, long time, but I love it. And right now I'm serving as a bishop of a Spanish ward here in Orem. So the way I'm going to lay this out then is to talk about 5 main principles that I have that basically guide my life. It's the way that I simplify all of the complications, I think, that come about through trying to really look at and unify all of the stuff from science and all of the stuff from religion, because that's really tough to do sometimes. And so I've boiled it down into 5 principles that guide the way that I do things. Principle number 1, I accept truth and knowledge no matter where it comes from. So I'm only after finding good ideas, and I don't care what the source of that idea is. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's look at some statements from previous leaders of the church. And again, if you're not LDS and you're watching this, you could most likely go to leaders of your own religious faith and find statements very similar. For example, in Catholicism, the current Pope, he has some really awesome statements about reconciling science and religion and how we accept truth no matter where it comes from. So Joseph Smith said, one of the grand fundamental principles of Mormonism is to receive truth. Let it come from whence it may. We should gather all the good and true principles in the world and treasure them up. Brigham Young, if you can find a truth in heaven, earth, or hell, it belongs to our doctrine. We believe it. It is ours. We claim it. Our religion will not clash with or contradict the facts of science in any particular. Or John Taylor, in regard to our religion, I will say that it embraces every principle of truth and intelligence pertaining to us as moral, intellectual, mortal, and immortal beings, pertaining to this world and the world that is to come. We are open to truth of every kind, no matter whence it comes, where it originates, or who believes in it. And then one of my favorite apostles that I love, and his grave is found in the Salt Lake Cemetery, so you can go up and see this. So this is James Talmage, and I like on his gravesite here, it says educator, scientist, apostle. I don't know that that was in any particular order, but maybe it was. Maybe he preferred educator, then scientist, then apostle. He just kind of speaks to my heart. And he said, Within the gospel of Jesus Christ, there is room and place for every truth, thus far learned by man or yet to be made known. So those are some early statements that basically say we accept truth. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Just truth is truth, and we're going to accept it. And I think most reasonable people in all religious faiths or non-religious faiths would essentially also agree with that basic notion. But sometimes conflict arises. Why? Well, I would argue that you have apparent conflict when, number one, you have accurate religion and inaccurate science. Two, inaccurate religion and accurate science. Or three, inaccurate religion and inaccurate science. My belief is that whenever you have accurate religion and accurate science, that they converge on the same truth. All truth will be circumscribed into one great whole. And this idea is not new. Even our current prophet, when he dedicated the new building at BYU, he said, there is no conflict between science and religion. Conflict only arises from an incomplete knowledge of either science or religion or both. When truth comes from a scientific laboratory, whether truth comes from a scientific laboratory or by revelation from the Lord, it is compatible. So essentially, he's summarizing those three principles I just talked about. And I even, sometimes think, though, if you go back through the history of the way that our church and other churches have talked about claims about nature, there are mistakes. There are times when the current principle, the current doctrine, the current position, whatever you want to call that, was incorrect. And that's not a problem. Okay? It's okay that religion could be wrong, and it's okay that science is wrong. Both of them need to be tentative, such that if there is a mistake or if there is an error, then it can be fixed. New light and knowledge, new evidence can get us closer and closer to the actual truth. I love Elder Uchtdorf, where he said, to be perfectly frank, there have been times when members or leaders in the church have simply made mistakes. There may have been things said or done that were not in harmony with our values, principles, or doctrine. So we don't need to be ashamed of it. In fact, I always argue that it is a positive characteristic of science that it is tentative, and it's willing to change its position if new evidence says you need to change your position. Perfect example in this climate right now was mask wearing. It wasn't quite clear, and we all were on the ride with this scientific endeavor of trying to figure out if masks make a difference or not. And then once enough science came about and showed that it did make a difference, then of course the scientific consensus is, yeah, it is making a difference. Another example of this where, and this is an extreme example, but it's a good one, right? Is that there are still people on the planet today who think the earth was flat. And if you go back even further, a lot of people thought the earth was flat. In fact, the majority of the people thought the earth was flat. And, if you look at this picture, well, that does kind of look flat, right? And if you have a very myopic view of trying to look at a particular knowledge claim, you may come to a conclusion that is incorrect because you're not looking at all of the evidence and taking all of the evidence into account. Well, if you back up and have not such a myopic view, you see, oh, the earth is a sphere. And it's not just that. I mean, what you have to do is take in all of the evidence, right? And so things just like pictures from space indicate this. Otherwise, if you're a flat earther, then you would have to somehow come up with, well, we send rocket ships and other things into space. They turn around and take a picture. Do we see that? Is that what we see? The Bible talks about the four corners of the earth, but clearly that shouldn't be taken literally because there's not four corners to the earth, it's a sphere. You can do simple experiments like measure the shadows of two identical height objects that are separated by a large distance at any time, right? And so you measure the length of the shadow and it's going to be different. Well, the only way that would be true is if you have the curvature of the earth. You could go and stand up on higher ground. And if you're on a higher ground, you're going to get more of a view, like in this case, of this tree. If you're higher up, you're going to see more of the tree. If you're lower down, you're not going to see as much of the tree. If it's round, that would be the hypothesis, and you can go out and test that. If it's absolutely flat, both individuals, independent of the height that they had, if they've got good enough eyesight, should be able to see the same amount of the tree. You can just look at like an eclipse, when an eclipse happens, or the phases of the moon, right? And when this eclipse happens, right, it's Earth getting in front of the sunlight that's bouncing off of the moon back to our eyes, and you see a curved line. If the Earth were flat, the eclipse would look like this. So clearly, this was an idea that was very much held by a lot of people. Science came along and was able to say, well, it's not quite right, and religion had to adjust. That's an example where religion was inaccurate and science was accurate, and we're getting closer to the truth. So accepting all evidence to inform our worldviews and choices, I believe is the most healthy way to go about reconciling these things. Is just you accept all evidence, and then that you let that evidence point you in the direction that you think you ought to go. Instead of cherry picking, choosing only some evidence that's acceptable information that specifically this is what a lot of people do, is they cherry pick information that aligns with their preconceived worldview, right? I mean, this happens a lot nowadays, especially in light of the internet, where people cherry pick ideas and evidences and information that aligns with the echo chamber in which they live, whether that be, a news station or a website or whatever it is, but people tend to do this a lot. And I would argue that it's better to look at all of the evidence, try to take a total view of the evidence to inform the choices about what your worldview is going to be. So in relation to evolution, what we see is that there's kind of this simplified double axis here. On one axis, we have how much did God intervene in the creation and in the making of this world and all of the organisms that live upon it. So how much did God intervene, whether it's total intervention or no intervention at all. And the other axis is how much of this was due to natural laws, all of it due to natural laws over here, or, a lot of natural laws or no natural laws, okay? And essentially, if you're a young earth creationist, which I kind of was that when I was growing up, you're up here where you think most of what resulted in earth was divine intervention with very little respect to the natural laws, okay? And then down here in this corner would be kind of the person who says there is no God whatsoever. It's just straight natural laws of evolution. So it's a materialistic evolution, right? But obviously there are other positions that are in between this large continuum. And so my life kind of started off where I was over there, and then I kind of meandered a little bit. I got some education and looked at my worldview and had to change a little bit what I was thinking and kept moving. But I think that was a good thing. I think if I have to move my position based on all of the evidence that I'm looking at, I think that's a good thing. And so basically, I always like to think, if I were to stand up right now and have to declare something, I am a happy seeker. I'm a happy seeker of knowledge. I don't care where the knowledge comes from. So basically, right, I'm a happy seeker, because to seek is to try to locate or discover, search for, to endeavor, to obtain, or research. That's kind of stupid. Let's get off that slide. So that's my first principle. My second principle is God is not a deceiver or a cheater. He understands and lives in perfect harmony with natural laws. Let me just quickly go through this, and most of my students will have heard this story, so I'm going to go very quickly. If you want to talk to me later about it, you can. But we have 46 chromosomes. The other great apes have 48 chromosomes. The ancestor had 48 chromosomes, so something happened along the branch leading to us. And if we go in and look at the chromosomes, we actually find the evidence of what happened. It turns out that two small chromosomes fused together in the chimpanzees, or in the ancestor leading to humans. And we know that because here you can see that in all of the other great apes, they have two shorter chromosomes that match up with our long one chromosome, our chromosome number 2. And these banding patterns essentially say that the underlying DNA is the same. It holds the same genes in the same order. And so we know for sure that these two chromosomes came together to form the large chromosome. Another example might be you look at a particular gene that has been turned off in us, in the apes, in the old world monkeys, and the new world monkeys, but was active in the other lemur, the other primates, and the other mammals. And this is a gene to make vitamin C. The gulo gene makes this. Well, it turns out that was an evolutionary mutation, or a set of mutations turned off that gene. Well, it doesn't matter, because most of the new world monkeys, old world monkeys, apes, and man have color vision. They can find fruits that are ripe, and they can get the vitamin C from there. But over here, they don't eat fruit like we do. But they don't need to, because they have a gene inside their body that makes vitamin C for them. So it's not a problem. And you can go in the actual DNA, and you can see these evidences of the same mistakes, the same mutations that turned the gene off are found in all of us and the great apes. And it's not just that it turned it off in the exact same way. So what does that have to do with God being a deceiver? Well, I just don't think God would put evidence like this, or evidence in the chromosomes, to make it look like it was evolution if it wasn't evolution. That, for me, just doesn't seem like the kind of God that would do that. So I don't think God is a deceiver. I think he understands and lives in perfect harmony with all natural laws, and he just uses those natural laws to bring about his purposes. Number 3, I believe, and then those two are like, I think can be applied almost across all religious people. And maybe even this one as well, but now I'm starting to get a little bit more Mormon-y, okay, if that's a word. I don't know, maybe I'm not supposed to use that word. But I think that one of the goals on my life is to strengthen my relationship with God, with deity, with Heavenly Father, with Heavenly Mother, the Holy Ghost, with whatever deity is. I also think that one of the goals in my life should be to strengthen my relationships with my family and with others. So that means I need to be better every day at trying to treat others non-judgmentally, with respect and mercy. And I'm not very good at this, but I'm trying to be better. I think it's a good goal to have. And I think that most of what the scriptures are about trying to have good relationships with God and trying to have good relationships with others. And finally, I think the last thing that I concentrate on and focus on is making and keeping covenants. And those are my 3 kind of more personal things, but these are my 5 principles that guide my life. Now, to just move then, to kind of shift gears a little bit, because undoubtedly some of the questions are going to be, well, what about some of these specific issues? And I think that we have to set up some understandings here, because sometimes I think that we are so concerned sometimes about what is a doctrine, what is a position, what is a suggestion, what is a policy, what is it, right? This becomes difficult. What is an official doctrine, at least in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And how does something become official? This is a tough thing to define. What is an official position, and how does something become official? Well, obviously, I think that most of us know that the most official thing in the church is the canonized scripture, because those things were approved by the entire church membership by a vote. And so that takes into account all of the canonized scriptures and those declarations that came, like the declaration to allow all worthy church members, or all worthy males to hold the priesthood, right? And so that's how it's happened. And this has changed. I mean, like in 1830, the Bible and Book of Mormon were officially accepted. In 1835, the Doctrine and Covenants were, the first 103 sections were accepted. In 1880, Doctrine and Covenants additional 32 sections. In 1890, polygamy was repealed. In 1976, Doctrine and Covenants sections 137 and 138 were added, right? So there's been things added. There's also been things taken out, like the Lectures of Faith was taken out at one point. So what is doctrine is not even that like for sure anyway, because something that can be included in the canon or can be taken out has changed over the years. What about an official position? Well, that's probably even less official, right? Because what could have been a position today might not have been a position 15 years ago. So positions change as well. Then the next level of kind of officialness might be something like, the proclamation to the world, because that was declared to all of the church body, and it was signed by the First Presidency and all the Quorum of the 12. Now, it was never submitted for ratification and canonization, but I mean, I would argue that if all 15 men are saying that, that's probably pretty high up on what's official. Doesn't exactly mean that everything in there is absolutely true, because, we haven't canonized it, but maybe it is. I don't know. I'm just saying you have to think about this, like what is most official and what's maybe a little bit less. Maybe you get to things like general conference talks, probably pretty official, although even some of those talks get modified then in the enzyme when they're published. What about when a leader goes to a state conference and says something? Is everything he says there official doctrine? Is it absolute truth? I think that what we have to just realize is that what is official doctrine, what is official position, can be a little bit muddy. It's not black and white. But clearly there are some things that are probably more official and some things that are less official. And I'll let you struggle with the rest of that. What I do know is that in Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord said, "Yea, verily I say unto you, in that day when the Lord shall come, he shall reveal all things." Now, in that day the Lord shall come, we're talking about the second coming. And he said, "Things which have passed, and hidden things which no man knew, things of the earth by which it was made, and the purpose and the end thereof." To me, it almost sounds like the Lord saying, I haven't told you how this is done. So sometimes when I hear people claim that they know an absolute sureness with this, right, with total surety that they know exactly how this happened, I don't know. The Lord says he hasn't really revealed it. So maybe we don't know. Maybe he wants us to kind of bumble along and gather all of the evidence that we possibly can and make the best position based on all of the evidence that's available to us. So he still shall reveal by which it was made. So then if we deal with specifically evolution, what are the most official things that we have? Well, I think one really official thing is what's called the BYU Evolution Packet. Now, this was created when I was going to BYU as an undergrad. This was 1992. And at this time, I would go to my religion classes and go to my science classes, and I would get fed with all of the statements that were pro-evolution and anti-evolution. And so it was really confusing. And a lot of students were having this problem. So there was this movement to basically say, let's come up with a packet that's going to contain the official statements of the church that could then be shared with the students that either are taking science classes dealing with evolution or religion classes dealing with origin of man. And so all of these statements were sent up to the general authorities. And what came back was these 4 statements. First was a statement from 1909, the first presidency, called The Origin of Man. And that one is longest, and it's also the one that may contain some statements that I think could be construed by some to be a little anti-evolution or anti-science. And this, by the way, 1909, my students should recognize that 09 year. That's 100 years after the birth of Charles Darwin and 50 years after the publication of The Origin of Species. And so what was happening is all over the United States, reporters were asking religious institutions, what do you guys think about this? We're celebrating Darwinism, we're celebrating evolution. What do you think about this? And so the church came up with this statement. Well, it really didn't calm things down. If anything, it almost made it worse. And so in 1910, they dedicated a portion of the Christmas message to talk a little bit further about this. And I'll show you some passages from that. And then it was kind of quiet. The leaders of the church didn't say anything about this for another 15 years. But in 1925, which was the year of the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, once again, reporters are asking churches, hey, what do you guys think about this? And the the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints published this. The first presidency did this statement called Mormon View of Evolution. Now, this one is essentially a subset of many of the statements of the 1909 statement, but I would argue all of the stuff that could have been construed as anti-evolution or anti-science were essentially excluded. And it's just a summary. It's a much smaller statement. And then that was it. That's the last time the first presidency has ever declared something to the church body officially. I think most people don't understand that. And as I would argue, have we learned anything about biology and evolution since 1925? Yeah, we've learned a ton. Now, the other thing that was included, though, in this packet was an article from 1992 written by Bill Evanson in Encyclopedia of Mormonism. And mostly what was in that article was some of the stuff from these other statements, but then in addition to that, some statements in the minutes of the first presidency's meeting. And so there's a little bit in there. And so I guess you could say in 1931, they also added that. But again, that was not like directed to the church as a total. That was only made known later and then included in the 1992 statement. So what are some of these things say? Well, in that 1931 meeting from the first presidency, they said this: the position of the church on the origin of man was published by the first presidency in 1909 and stated again by a different first presidency in 1925. And so here's the position. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, basing its belief on divine revelation, ancient and modern, declares man to be the direct and lineal offspring of deity. Man is the child of God. Well, think about this. I sing this song a lot. I am a child of God. But I don't sing that song because my physical body is the child of Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother. I sing it because my spirit is the spiritual offspring of Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother. So that statement doesn't have anything to do with the physical body. It's a statement about our relationship to God spiritually. Upon the fundamental doctrine of the church, we are all agreed our mission is to bear the message of the restored gospel to the world. Leave geology, biology, archaeology, whatever ology to do scientific research. We're going to worry about other stuff. So the church clearly is saying, let science do what science does. Let biology learn about evolution and have them bring their best ideas, and we'll accept them. In 1910, one of my favorite statements that they did was exactly related to this. They said, our religion is not hostile to real science. That which has been demonstrated, we accept with joy. I love that, right? And I would argue that evolution has absolutely been demonstrated. If you don't believe me, come take my class. Or if you're in my class, right, think about all of the things that we've talked about, right? I think that evolution has been demonstrated. And so the church's position is essentially, oh, well, we accept that then. If science is a way of knowing, a way of finding truth, is confident about this, right, to a certain level, then we accept that. That's not a problem. Now, recently in 2016, there was an article in the New Era. So I don't know how official this is. It didn't have an author to it, so I don't know who wrote it, but this is what it was in response to a question. What does the church believe about evolution? And here's the first part of that response. The church has no official position on the theory of evolution, organic evolution, or changes to species. Inherited traits over time is a matter for scientific study. Nothing has been revealed concerning evolution. So essentially the church, I think, has made its official position, there is no position about evolution, and specifically about how did the physical bodies of Adam and Eve come about, or how did the physical bodies of Homo sapiens come about. Now, I would argue still, though, that evolution has demonstrated this, and so perhaps the church, in not a formal way, has kind of said, okay, well, we're fine with that. But at least this is the most recent, kind of most official thing, is that the church has no official position. So those are the two documents I would have you go read if you want to learn more about this: the BYU Evolution Packet and this New Era October 2016 article. By the way, if you go to the Bean Museum, the Natural History Museum on BYU campus, there's an entire wall that says this: Perspectives of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And they essentially take from the 1910 statement that I just read you, and they also take from this New Era October 2016. So it was approved also for the BYU Museum there for the public. And they have entire displays that they've done of human evolution with all of our hominid ancestors. And right now, if you go there, there's this tree with all of the different skulls. And you can go and look at this. And it says hominid evolution. So again, if BYU, and being the church's institution, if the church was so against this, why would they allow something like this to be there? I mean, I just don't see that happening. Or why would they allow evolution to be a course that's required for all biology majors, right? That just doesn't make sense to me. By the way, this is what's at the museum in the University of Utah, something very similar. Okay, so just a few additional thoughts, and then we'll do some questions. So it is okay to have some disagreement and to just not know some things for now. By this, what I mean is, it's okay if sometimes there is conflict in your worldview and you're not able to figure out what does the scientific record, the historical record, whatever other places that you're going to go for evidence, for knowledge claims, if any of that is messing with what you think in your religious worldview, that's probably okay, because sometimes that's just going to happen. I mean, I still haven't come to grips with a lot of things, but I'm a happy seeker. It's okay to meander, and it's okay to change your position if new evidence says you need to. Number two, I think we need more humility from science. I think scientists need to recognize that sometimes we're wrong, and that if we're wrong, we need to accept that, and we move forward. But I would say the same thing for religion, especially in the Mormon church. I think sometimes some people think that they are so confident about what they think they know is true, when in reality it's not, or in reality we don't know. So I think humility is a good thing. I think scientists need to do a better job at communicating. I don't think we've done a good job. I still don't think we do a good job. I mean, we need to be better at this. And so this is why I do things like this, but this is also why I love teaching. I'm passionate about trying to deliver the best evidence and best arguments for the best ideas that we have. Number four, we've learned a lot about evolution since Darwin. And so we ought to accept those scientific consensus ideas that we've learned. And finally, that which has been demonstrated, let's just accept it with joy, and then let's just move forward, okay? So that's the end of my remarks, and now I am ready for some questions. And I'm trying to figure out how I should do this. Let's see. How do we want to do this? Should we just jump in verbally?
I kind of have a question.
Okay. And so when you have the question, please say your name and then say, like, if you're a student of mine or if you're a friend or a family member or something, just so people have context of who you are.
Okay. I'm Josh Leon, and I'm a student of yours.
Okay.
So you said the church, they really don't reject it. They're just open to it. But why? I feel like if they would come out and just accept it, more of the supporters would as well. So I guess my question is, why can't they just come out and say it, that they accept evolution?
I don't know. Me and some of my colleagues have asked that question. And in response, for many years, it was, we're not going to address that. But there's a good indication that there might be one of these LDS gospel essays that's going to address this in the coming future. But that's why I showed you the BYU evolution packet and then that New Era article. Those are kind of the two things that I would say are perhaps the most official positions of the church in regards to this. But look, the church hasn't come out and said, we accept gravity. The church hasn't come out and said, we accept the germ theory. So the church doesn't have to come out and say that they accept, specifically every single scientific theory. I mean, that would be kind of onerous and ridiculous for them to do that. So maybe that's part of their position, but I agree with you. I wish they would, because I think this particular scientific theory gets at who we are as human beings. And so it really deals with origin of humans, and it's something that people care about. So I wish they would. And like I said, it seems like they might at least come out with a gospel essays on this.
I think they need to get you to be the spokesperson for that.
There's plenty of good spokesperson on this subject. So
okay, thank you.
But thank you, yeah.
I have a question. Okay. I'm Amy. I'm in one of your classes. So I remember in class we were talking about like the extinction of the hominids and how religious people sometimes think that the creation of like our human, like that, what's the scientific name for, what are we called? Homo sapiens?
Homo sapiens.
So like that creation was like the Adam and Eve thing. I was wondering in that class, like I wanted to ask you, but I was like, I'll just wait till this. But like, what do you think, like Adam and Eve, like what do you think that event was?
This, by the way, is usually the first question that I get every semester. So I actually have a little bit of a theme plan for this one, okay? So let's talk Adam and Eve, when and where. Now, again, this is not any official position, but this is kind of how I do it, okay? So the first thing we have to remember is that according to our scientific knowledge, right, we know that Homo sapiens evolved at least 200,000 years ago. There is overwhelming evidence to support this. We also know that then, and that all of those Homo sapiens lived in Africa. So we're all African, all of us. We are all African because we all come from African ancestors. But then about 100,000 years ago, there was a bottleneck event. There was this shrinking of that population of that species, of this species Homo sapien, down to about 10,000 individuals. And as we've learned in our classes, whenever that happens, you get a reduction in the genetic diversity that's present. And this is what explains why all humans are really genetically similar, especially compared to our most close relative, the chimpanzees, which have a ton of genetic diversity in their populations. Okay, so then after that bottleneck, though, Homo sapiens leaves Africa and starts to go out all over the planet. And they populate the entire planet, right? Getting over here into the Americas at least 12 or 13,000 years ago, and potentially even back to 20,000 years ago. So then the population gets bigger and bigger. Here's just a map showing, you know, some estimates of when these migration events took place, right? But then eventually all the population gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's been growing very quickly. And we're now at 7 billion individuals, okay? So where do Adam and Eve fit into? Because that's what we know from science, and we're very confident about that, all of that in science. So what do we know about Adam and Eve? Well, we know that the official position about them is that they are the first man and woman, and that Adam and Eve are the primal parents of our race. Well, this idea then of first man has to be examined a little bit more carefully. What does that mean by first man? So just like in the scriptures it says 4 corners of the earth, well, it doesn't actually mean 4 corners. It means something different. So what might be a nuanced view of first man? Well, one thing could be is that Adam and Eve lived at 6,000 years ago. They were taken from this large population of Homo sapiens that existed, and they were placed into a Garden of Eden, and they, you know, were given these choices of what they should do. They ended up taking of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. They fell, they were taken out of the Garden of Eden, and they started to live their lives and teach people about the gospel, and they ran into other Homo sapiens, right? Because their kids got married to people. Or maybe they were part of this population at 200,000 years ago, and what's in the scriptures is much more allegorical, right? That, you know, that timeline in the scriptures isn't quite exact. Or maybe they were part of this bottleneck event, right? But we don't know. And it could have been, if they were part of these earlier populations, you know, who knows how long they were in the Garden of Eden? Maybe the Garden of Eden was an isolated area on earth that had different kinds of rules and things. I mean, they were eating of the tree of life, and supposedly that gave them perpetual life. They would have never died had they continued to just stay in the Garden of Eden and eaten of the tree of life, according to the scriptures. So perhaps that's possible. I mean, I think that anywhere along here is possible, okay? Well, but still, this doesn't account for the idea of the first man, because what about all these other men and women that are here? Well, this is where I say Adam and Eve are the first because of these 3 characteristics. Now, again, I could be completely wrong here, but this is how I do it if you're going to accept the idea that Adam and Eve are real people. There is another position that some people take that are reasonable members of the church, and they just say that's a story, that they weren't actual people. But I still believe, so this is my own belief, I think they were actual people. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but that's what I think right now. And so because I think that, the way that I reconcile this idea of first man and being the primal parents is that they were the first Homo sapiens with a physical body. I'm sorry, not the first, that they had a physical body in the species Homo sapiens, that they were spiritual offspring of God. So in other words, they had spirits. And number 3, that they learned about the gospel and they made covenants. And I think Adam and Eve were the first ones to have those 3 characteristics, all 3 of them. And that's what I think means the first man. And if you think about the temple, for those of you that have gone, essentially, that's the point of the temple, is to show that they were the ones that made covenants first. And then they had to go teach others about that. And just as we accept adoption into the family of Abraham when we're baptized, if we're not literally a descendant of Abraham, I see no reason why we can't adopt ourselves into the family of Adam such that he becomes the primal parent of our race when we accept covenants and make covenants, especially the covenants of the temple. I also see no reason that we couldn't do vicarious work for the dead for all of these people, who, whenever they lived, for all of these Homo sapiens that potentially had spiritual offspring inside of them. I see no reason why we can't do that. Because we do it for the people in the Dark Ages. Well, why not for the people in the 100,000 to 200,000 year ago? I mean, I just don't see why not. But that's kind of how I do it. Again, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just saying there are ways in which you yourself can study this out in your mind, out of the best books, and come to a conclusion. You can pray about it. We're supposed to pray and study and come to conclusions. So that's what I argue that you do. Okay. And are there any other questions about Adam and Eve while we're on that topic? Or if anyone wants to just chime in, that's fine too. This doesn't have to be just questions from me. Wow, I either explained that really well, or you're all absolutely stunned that a bishop would say that. So I don't know which one it is.
I'll hop in here and
okay.
I'll have something else to ask. I'm Morgan, currently taking a class from you. I'm not really religious myself, but I'm very fascinated with this. I'm just curious. I kind of a thing you're probably also asked about a lot is a Noah's Ark.
Yeah, I do get asked about. Whoops, we skipped though. You didn't go in order.
I didn't go in order. I'm sorry.
Yeah, the flood and the ark is a question that I do get sometimes. This is clearly one where you can't take it literal. There's no scientific evidence to support the idea that less than 6,000 years ago, there was a global flood that killed everything except for 2 individuals of terrestrial organisms. And that flood would have killed all freshwater organisms as well, because the salt water would have mixed with all the fresh water. So, and that we would have had that much water to get over all of the mountains. Just all of those things don't come to bear. Plus, if you ever take a course in population genetics in biology, you learn about the idea that if you go to just 2 individuals, the amount of genetic variation that's going to come out of that is so small, and they're so subject to probably going extinct because there's so little variation that they just wouldn't survive. Plus, what are they going to eat? What are you going to feed them? How are you? I mean, just all of that is a problem. So I say either, once again, it could, some members of the church just take that as a story, that it's a story to teach us that we ought to give each other second chances or something like that, right? But maybe it was more of a local event, because sometimes in the scriptures, when they talk about world and the earth or the land, they don't mean all of the earth. Sometimes they just mean a region. And it's possible there could have been a regional flood, and it's possible they could have built a boat, and it's possible they could have put some organisms on there, and that this became a story that was a global and that had all organisms. But there's no evidence that there was a global flood with all organisms, all terrestrial organisms only being on this ark. That just wouldn't happen. I mean, I've talked about this before, but just beetles alone, right now we've described about 600,000 species of beetles. You think they went out and collected every single one of those beetles? Because beetles do not evolve into new species, or at least to 600,000, in 6,000 years. It takes millions of years to evolve that many species of beetles. So there's just no way it could, and that's just the ones we've described. There's another 1 million or 2 or 3 species of beetles that we haven't described yet on planet Earth. And that's just what's alive today. That's not even counting everything that's gone extinct. What's alive today only represents 1% of everything that's survived. So 99% of all things have already gone extinct. And we know that because we can go into the fossil record and estimate that. So that's one of those where it's like some scriptures you just can't interpret literally. You can't take it literally. You got to take it in the context. And I'm not a specialist in how to read scriptures necessarily. There's other people that are much smarter in that. And I would, if anyone's interested, I can send you to those people who tell you how to interpret scriptures better. But what I can say from my evidence is that the evidence is overwhelming that there's no way there could have been a global flood with an ark that contained all of the diversity of the terrestrial life. That just doesn't make sense. but it doesn't mean it's not a good story that can teach us something.
Hey, Bishop, it's Ryan and Emily Lemasters. Just wanted to, more than anything, just thank you for putting this together. We've obviously had a sneak preview before, but each time we learn about it, just appreciate your insight. And I think it's an important voice for, those of faith or not of faith to understand each other's perspectives. I appreciated, it's not the gentleman just spoke before, not necessarily being religious, or oriented with a faith. It's like just really means a lot to be able to, especially in a world where we're all so divisive right now.
Yeah. I picked a good time to do this.
Yeah, exactly. Just understand, each other's perspectives a little bit better. So anyway, just a thank you from us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Ryan. Any other questions? I do have those 2 other ideas there, but are there any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Dr. Ogden, this is Danny Ferguson, a past student of yours.
Yeah.
My wife is really interested in this death before the fall that you have up there, and we'd love to hear your opinions on that.
Okay, so this is another one that sometimes we get. The reason I put this one up here too is because I remember specifically teaching this on my mission to people, because I was reading these books that were written by church leaders that tended to go a little bit anti-science, anti-evolution. And these were books that had just kind of barely been translated into Spanish. And so they were kind of new. And so I thought I was giving these people some really cool ideas that they'd never heard. And I remember talking about that there was no death before the fall, that was a gospel doctrine, a gospel truth. Well, of course, now that I've advanced in my knowledge of extinction, clearly there has been death before the fall. There's even been death probably before the fall of Adam and Eve. As I showed you on that previous slide, there were tons of people that lived before Adam and Eve. Unless somehow Adam and Eve were that very first, among that very first population of Homo sapiens, unless you push it back to that moment, I guess then you could say that then death in Homo sapiens didn't happen before the fall. But did just death happen before the fall? Of course death happened before the fall. We have so much evidence of extinction in our geologic record. Of course it happened. Plus, if you're going to be literal about things, well, weren't Adam and Eve eating things in the Garden of Eden? Well, when they ate something, didn't those cells die as it went through their digestive tracts? So of course there was death before the fall. I now look at it and go, that was a ridiculous thing of me to teach, and I'm embarrassed that I taught it. I shouldn't have.
Hey, Dr. Ogden, can you kind of explain what the death before the fall was? I'm a little confused.
So this comes, again, it comes from kind of an anti-science, anti-evolution, some statements from a church leader, okay, that talked about this in some books that became well-published and well-read. One of them that you'll recognize was called Mormon Doctrine, right? And that book, a lot of people read that thinking that was the definitive doctrine of the church. Well, it turns out that book had a lot of mistakes in it, one of which was this idea that there was no death before the fall, no death before the fall of Adam and Eve, meaning that everything was created, right? Like it looks like in the Judeo-Christian story, everything's created, Adam and Eve are created, and they're in the Garden of Eden, and everything is just alive, and everything's just going on with this eternal living. And then as soon as they partake of the fruit, then the fall happens, mortality is introduced into the world, and things can die. I just think that view of the fall doesn't mesh with what we see in the scientific record.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. Anything else? Come on, speak up if you want to. Don't be shy. Christy, if you're trying to talk, you're on mute. Christy, are you trying to talk? Oh, okay.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
I just am a biology student here at UVU.
Great.
I'm just wondering, clearly, obviously, the dinosaurs existed, they lived and they died. And I'm just wondering what your opinions are on what role may have played in God's plan for everything. Obviously, that was a very long time ago, but I've always just wondered, like, why, you know? I mean, I don't know if you have the answer to that. I don't think anybody really
No,
does.
I mean, obviously I don't have the answer, but I asked that to my mom when I was like 8 or 9 years old, because I was reading a book about dinosaurs, and I was like, what about dinosaur? How did they? And she basically just said, I don't know. Like, and so I've thought about that a lot. I remember there's a time when I tried to explain this, that dinosaurs' purpose was to create all of the oil fields so that we could have oil. Well, it turns out dinosaurs are not the most important part of that. It's mostly just swamplands and other things that create oil fields. So what's the purpose? Well, I don't know. I mean, think about it. I think that God, so Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother are up there and they're watching this creation go about. I think they're just getting joy of watching, oh, look at what evolution did here. Oh, look at what direction it went here. Now, perhaps this is kind of, don't quote me on this, okay? Well, I guess this is being recorded, so it is getting quoted. But perhaps, you know, if you want to say that every once in a while God does intervene on this planet in the direction in which the evolution is kind of going, which I can accept that that's possible. However, I am also okay if God never intervened, if he just let it happen because he knew that all the natural laws were going to work in particular ways. But let's follow the story that perhaps, you know, we remember Earth or life starts at 3.5 billion years ago, and it's chugging along and chugging along and chugging along. And we get up to 250 million years ago. So a lot of evolution has already happened. The dinosaurs get on the planet. They start evolving. They become the dominant life form on planet Earth. Maybe God was like, all right, well, maybe this organism is going to work its way into becoming bipedal, to becoming, you know, with big eyes, a big brain, to essentially have a humanoid, a godlike type form. If this is what God's form looks like, right? Apparently it is, or at least that's what people who have seen God have said this is what he looks like. So if that's true, maybe he was letting the dinosaurs maybe try to give their shot at, you know, via evolution tinkering to get to that kind of a body form. And maybe it just wasn't working out. Like Tyrannosaurus Rex was just too dumb and didn't quite work, right? And so I've said, maybe God somewhere over there is like, all right, time to put this asteroid on this Earth and kind of reboot the system. And when that happened, when that asteroid came, it did. It got rid of the dinosaurs. And these little tiny rodent-like creatures that were basically scurrying around underneath, they were not the dominant life form on the planet. Guess what? They got their shot. And they're the ones that then started to dominate the planet and started to diversify. And they diversified into all sorts of kind of creatures. Eventually you got these primate-like creatures. And eventually those led to monkey-like creatures, and eventually ape-like creatures, and eventually hominids. And then eventually you get this version of a hominid that's got this huge brain. They're really smart, you know, and maybe God's like, all right, we're ready to put our spirits inside of them. I don't know, right? Like, I mean, that's one way to say maybe, you know, it's not like organisms have purposes in the sense of that they had to have this godlike purpose. I think it's okay if God's just kind of hands off and he's just kind of watching the process happen. And he's just getting joy out of being like, wow, a duck-billed platypus. Look at how awesome that is. Like evolution created that. And at the same time, he's watching a marsupial evolve into a mole, and he's watching a placental mammal evolve into a mole. And you put them side by side, and they look exactly alike because convergent evolution moved them to have the same body type. So that's why I don't think that God was really rolling the dice in the sense that it was just all dumb luck chance, because evolution is not just chance. There are physics involved. There are chemistry. There's limits on physics, limits on chemistry, and there's limits on what's going to happen in evolution. If you've got water and you've got prey and a predator, the predator by nature is going to be putting structures up near the top of its head, like eyes and other sensitive organisms, and that's where the mouth is going to be. You're going to create an organism that is eventually going to be bilaterally symmetrical, that's going to have most of its important features up on the head, and it's going to have a digestive tract, right? And then at some point, you know, if it wants to get up on land, well, it's got to have some form of getting around, and so it's got to turn fins into legs, and evolution tinkers and does all of this. So again, could God have been nudging evolution in particular ways until he gets his Homo sapien form and then starts the plan of salvation in that way? Potentially. But it's just as likely that maybe they just sat back and just enjoyed what evolution was tinkering with while they're enjoying other worlds, right? There's worlds without number. Maybe there's some others out there that Heavenly Father and Heavenly Mother just go around and just are like, look at how cool, look at what happened in the last million years here. I don't know. At least that for me, that's my idea of kind of heaven, right? It's like I just get to go around and just explore and learn about all of these worlds. So I kind of got off subject there, but Caden, did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I've thought along those lines very, very similar in the past. So that just kind of, that was great.
Thanks.
Hey, I have a question.
Yes.
This is Steven from one of your classes. So earlier you were talking about how one of your, when you were talking about accepting all truths, you felt like one of the best ways to get that was from the scriptures. So I was wondering, in certain places, like in the Book of Mormon, it talks about how all living things have been in the same state, or in Doctrine and Covenant, it talks about how the temporal existence has only been around for 7,000 years. So how do you reconcile those very contradicting statements? Do you feel like the scriptures are just not all true, or do you accept those as truths?
Again, it's kind of like, do you think that the earth has four corners? Like literal four corners? No, you have to read that with some nuance. You have to say, well, that's not what they mean. What they mean is they're going to preach the gospel into all parts of the earth, right? And so just like if you said, well, the earth was created in its form and it's never changed. Well, maybe what they meant was the conditions upon which Adam and Eve were living in the Garden of Eden was different. And so they could have had their own little, remember, if you think about the creation of Adam and Eve, they were created outside of the Garden of Eden, and then they were placed into the Garden of Eden, indicating that there's something different about where they were at. So you could still have a somewhat literal reading of that interpretation and say, okay, Adam and Eve were placed into this garden. They were living there, it had a different condition, and then at some point they ate of the fruit. Okay, prior to that, everything that was around them perhaps was in a different state, right? Can you see how that, if you take kind of a nuanced view of what Garden of Eden is, what Adam and Eve are, and then what happens after their fall that they have, that could be applied more literally to those kinds of scriptures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, so again, the big principle is, I don't think you can take scriptures exactly literal, okay? Because clearly there are examples where you can't take it literally, right? And so what does that mean? Well, then you have to learn how to start having a nuance with how you read scripture. And again, I read the scriptures, but I'm not a scholar of how to read and interpret scriptures. How do you take in context, when it was written, how it was written, who was it written for, what happened to those documents and all of the years that intervened, all of those things. There are other specialists who have dealt with that. And if anyone wants to, I'm happy to send you towards some of those people that specialize in that, specifically in relation to creation and the evolution of man as well.
I have a question more personally. This is Amy again. I have so many questions. But just for like a more your opinion, how is it being a bishop and having, like you said, like you have different views than when you were raised? And like, how do you converse with members in your ward who might disagree with you?
Exactly how I'm conversing with you. And you've seen me in class. That's how I converse with the members of my ward. And sometimes members of the ward get a little offended by the way that I talk. But I hope they don't. I try to do it with love and I try to do it with understanding. But like if a member, here's a perfect example that's not even science, okay? I remember being in my ward. This wasn't when I was the bishop. I was the counselor in a bishopric. And I remember the sister that was teaching the Sunday school lesson was talking about tithing. And she claimed that the absolute truth of tithing is that you must pay your tithing on your gross, not on your net or not after taxes or not, there's all these little nuances, right, of money that gets taken out. But she said you have to pay it on your gross, and that's exactly the true doctrine. Well, it turns out that's not the doctrine. The doctrine is simply in Doctrine and Covenants. It says that the 10th part of your annual increase. Well, what is your annual increase? Well, it doesn't describe exactly what that is. And when that scripture was written, we didn't have FICA and and retirement funds and all of the other kinds of ways in which our money gets divided. So each person, and if you go and ask a bishop this, they'll read you out of the church manual what it says. It says that that is to be determined by the member and the Lord, right? So the church is not, I don't think the church should be giving you all these little details. The problem is we've grown up in a church. I grew up in a church. I think you younger generation are much better at this, but I grew up thinking that I need to know black and white. You tell me everything I'm supposed to do, and I'm going to do it with exactness, like the sons of Helaman. And that's what I'm going to do. But you need to tell me everything that I'm supposed to do. And that's just not the world that we live in nowadays. And I don't think it's a good world. I think it's better exercising faith when you don't kind of know and you have to figure it out, and you've got to struggle with what's true. You got to struggle with where does your heart take you. I think that's healthy. And so when I talk to members of my ward, I try to talk to them a little bit about how we don't know everything, and that's okay. And it's okay if you're struggling with a particular idea. If you're struggling with how to deal with LGBTQ issues, that's okay. Struggle with it and try to figure it out. And I think that we have for too long tried to not be uncomfortable with those issues. And I think a little bit of uncomfortableness is good. I think God wants us to kind of be that way, because otherwise, why is he not just solving every problem then? Why does he let kids and disasters and all of these terrible things happen in the world? Why doesn't he come in and intervene? Well, I think the answer is he wants us to struggle. He wants us to experience. He wants us to grow. Did that answer your question, Amy?
Yeah, that did.
Okay.
Can I ask another question?
You can ask as many questions as you want.
So I remember that you were talking in class about how you've received letters from parents about them not liking that you're teaching evolution. Did you respond to those, or like how did you react to that?
I did. I answered the emails, but I basically answered in this way. I said, thank you for your concern. And I said, my videos are all available online, and I gave them the link to my videos. And I said, you're welcome to watch any of these. And if you have any specific questions about any of this, I'm happy to talk about it with you. Never had a parent come back to me after that.
That's funny. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Anything else? Or if anyone wants to jump in with their own comment, you're welcome to do that too. It doesn't have to be me answering everything, because I don't have all the answers.
Does it have to be evolution related?
No, you can ask any question you want. Is fair game tonight on this Zoom call, because this is whatever. I'll do whatever you want to talk about.
Okay. So from what I've gotten, you're not a Bible literalist. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Not anymore.
Yeah. So how do you feel about like the miracles that Jesus performed? Because obviously that's not scientifically
right. Because again, I think that there are some knowledge. There's some knowledge that is not accessible by science, at least at this point. And so that kind of knowledge is only accessible through a different kind of evidence, a spiritual evidence. So I personally believe that Jesus Christ is my Savior. I believe that he died and that he resurrected. I have no idea how that process happens, but I believe it. And so this is where I'm really careful about the words that I use. You've noticed in class that whenever I talk about evolution, I always say I accept evolution, because I accept the evidence that I've looked at for evolution. But with that knowledge claim of Christ being the Savior and the atonement, I believe in that. I've chosen to believe that that's true because I've had feelings inside of my being that I believe are outside of my own chemistry and my own biology. And so I've had those divine experiences that I think is evidence that that is a confirmation of that truth. And so I don't know if people would call that separating. I really don't look at it that way. I just look at it as there's a lot of evidence that can teach me about the natural world. But if I want to learn about something that's spiritual, like a truth claim that is coming as a being that resurrected, we have no evidence for that in the scientific community, but that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't do it once. And so I believe that he did. I believe that happened once. But it's the same thing. Like, I've gained knowledge through sonnets and poems. Remember, I talked about this in class, like when I saw the eclipse. I understand completely how it is that the sun or the moon moved in front of the sun and blocked out the sunlight. I understand how that happened. But what I experienced standing in Rexburg, Idaho, was beyond what I understand scientifically about it. I had an experience that was moving that I'll never forget. And so I gained some knowledge about just who I am and where I am in this world, in this universe. And it was magical. It was something divine, I guess, if you want to call it that, or whatever you want to call it. And so that was knowledge that I gained by being there in Rexburg at that time. Had I stayed in Utah, it wouldn't have happened. So does that kind of answer your question, Josh?
Yeah, it does. I love the way how you differentiate. That was a good, how you say accept and believe, because I've definitely started saying I accept evolution rather than I believe evolution. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and what's powerful about the belief thing too is that a lot of times there might be as many reasons not to believe as there are to believe. And that's where it comes down to every person. You get to choose. We have free agency to choose. And you can either choose to believe or to not believe. And I think that it's in that action of choice where the most prominent kind of faith is explored, is choosing to believe. And that's my own individual choice. And if someone chooses not to do that, that is completely fine. Like, I have no problem with that. I just want them to be a good people. Like, remember my fifth principle, my fourth principle, we should have good relationships with people and treat them with mercy and with love and compassion, right? So if someone doesn't choose to believe, to be religious, fine. I have no problem with that. If any of my children chose that, I would have no problem with that. At least now. 20 years ago, I would have, but I don't anymore. And I'm fine with that as long as they're good people, as long as they, treat each other with respect and mercy. That's for me, that's why that's my fourth important principle that I live by.
That's a very refreshing outlook on things.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan.
I have a little comment.
Yeah.
Okay, so first, wait, no, I forgot. So technically, my name is Benjamin Jensen, and I was in your ward, but now I'm not. So my comment is just a little explanation of what I think happened with Adam and Eve. Since when you mentioned the thing that when you showed us that slide of that, it was like different schools, and it showed. I noticed that there was like a change in the schools until I finally saw like the normal human today school of someone.
You mean this one?
Yeah, that one. I when I saw that last school of like real human, I'm like, okay, since that's a real human, and people like say that Adam and Eve looked like real humans and they were real humans. I don't know. First, when I learned of that mutation thing of DNA, first I guess humans first must have had like gotten through an evolution to finally get to be like have like the same skull and bones that we know that are human bones today. So I guess those mutations would have had been real people, and I guess that wouldn't have it would have it would have had ended up being millions of people before Adam and Eve, and then finally Adam and Eve would end up being like the last people. Well, the first human type to have that type of bones, but maybe the rest didn't have that same type of bones.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. What age? How old are you now?
8.
8. Yeah. So even this though this is trying to show all of some of the species that have been described. This is not all of the hominid species, by the way. There are others. And this is only what we found. There are a lot of things that have lived on planet Earth that died, and we have no fossil, we have not discovered a fossil of them. So remember, this is an incomplete view of hominid evolution. Nonetheless, it's actually pretty good. And you got to remember that these are just one representation among dozens and dozens of fossils, especially when you get into things that are more closely related to humans. We have hundreds and hundreds of fossils, and here we're only showing one skull. Like here's Neanderthal, and so we're only showing one skull here, right? But there could be there's a lot more evidence to this whole story, and what you said is correct. Little mutations that cause changes in the population, such that some individuals maybe have a little bit longer bones, or some individuals have a little bit bigger forehead, which means you can have a little bit bigger brain. And you have all of these variations starting to happen in a population of organisms. And those that happen to have the little bit bigger brain, or maybe the little bit longer femur, maybe they're better at surviving. And so their children are going to be a little bit bigger and a little bit smarter. And that happens generation after generation, millions of years, and you end up with Homo sapiens. So the story of human evolution is actually pretty well documented. We have a really good sampling of what happened. We don't know exactly what happened, but we have a really good evidence of what happened. And exactly what you said, it all starts with mutations in the DNA that lead to changes in the phenotype, into what an organism looks like, that then leads into larger transformations in the morphology of an organism, and ultimately new species.
Oh, well, thanks.
You're welcome. Great question. Anything else as the participants are dwindling? I'll go as long as you guys want to go, but if there's nothing else, then we can end, but I'm happy to keep going.
I just want to say thanks, Dr. Ogden. This was really cool.
You're welcome, Josh. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Yeah, we really enjoyed this. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thanks, James. Hey, you got a smart little one there with you.
Lots of questions. That's good. That's good.
The participants are disappearing.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. It's yeah, I remember having this conversation with James when we first got married, and because I didn't grow up with all this, knowledge, it was a bit of a shock for me, to be honest with you.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. I had many dark nights working my way through this.
Yeah. So the last almost 11 years, we've been talking a lot about it, and it's been enlightening. It's been really enlightening. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah, that's the other thing for those of you who are still here. If this is shocking or it's hard to wrap your brain, don't be discouraged. It's difficult to deal with these big worldview things that happen, but it's not a bad thing. Remember, we need to all be happy seekers.
That's right. Yep.
Okay, any other comments or questions? All right, well then let me just, for those that are still here, let me just share because people always tend to leave, and then I have one more kind of thought that I like to leave. Let me get through all of this. Okay. Okay, whoops here. Too far. It's going crazy now on me. Okay, so you guys know President Eyring. This is President Eyring's father. His name is Henry Eyring, and he was a professor. He was a doctor of chemistry. In fact, he came up with an equation that's really important in chemistry. Probably should have gotten the Nobel Prize for that, but that's a different story. But he said this. He said, there are a few ways in which good people do more harm to those who take them seriously than to defend the gospel with arguments that won't hold water. Many of the difficulties encountered by young people going to college would be avoided if parents and teachers were more careful to distinguish between what they know to be true and what they think may be true. Impetuous youth, upon finding the authority it trusts crumbling, even on unimportant details, is apt to lump everything together and throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't want any of you, I don't, if you're sitting there and you're trying to decide, wow, do I continue to believe or do I accept this stuff? I mean, in some ways I'm like, don't throw everything out that was good in your beliefs if you're still finding ways that it's hard to reconcile this. I'd really hate to be the person that does that. But so I like this quote from Henry Eyring, but I also like this where he says, some have asked me, is there any conflict between science and religion? He's like, there's no conflict in the mind of God, but often there's conflict in the minds of men. A young man said, in high school, we are taught such things as pre-Adamic man and that kind of thing. But we hear another thing in church. What should I do about it? And I love this. I think I gave the right answer. I said, in this church, you only have to believe the truth. So go find out what the truth is. And with that, I will end. Thank you for being part of this night talk. And if any of you want to talk to me personally, I'm always happy to do a personal get together as well. Okay?
I would definitely like to show a little bit of the facts that I learned.
Your friends, your cousins. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
I think you're good.
I'm going to end the meeting now.